Section 50 of the Endeavour Journal of Sir Joseph Banks. Journal from 25 August 1768 to 12 July 1771 by Joseph Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Section 50. October 1770. 1770, October 1. Thunder and lightning with heavy rain all night. About 12 land was seen by the flashes, which in the morn proved to be Java Head and Princess Island. At noon we had a good observation, and found that Princess Island was laid down in La Neptune Orientale, 7 or 8 miles too far to the northward, and in the English East India Pilot or Quarter Waggoner, 21 or 22, which extraordinary difference in the latter seems owing to some mistake in his particular draught of the Straits, all parts of which are laid down 14 minutes at least different from the rest of his draughts, as well as his own sailing directions. The breeze was fresh and tolerably favourable, so that at night we had passed Crocata, and stood on by very clear moonlight, though the clouds above the horizon threatened, and it lightened a good deal. 1770, October 2. Several lights were seen abreast of the ship the greatest part of the night, which in the morn proved to be made by fishermen in small canoes. At daylight we were abreast of the 4th point, and stood forward with but little wind, having sent a boat ashore for grass for the buffaloes, who during their stay on board had not had more victuals than any one of them could eat in a day, and that the remainder of some bad hay, which the goat had dunged upon time immemorial almost. Before noon she returned, bringing some with her, which the Indians had not only given to our people, but even assisted them to cut. She also brought a few plantains and coconuts, but they were bought excessive dear. The country looked from the ship hilly and very pleasant, though almost one continued wood. Bantam Hill seemed very high land. As we proceeded on, we opened 2 large ships, laying at anchor behind Anchor Point. Soon after this it dropped calm, and we came to an anchor and sent a boat on board the ship for news. They were Dutch East India men, one bound for Cochin, on the coast of Coromandel, the other for Ceylon. Their captains received our officer very politely, and told him some European news, as that the government in England were in the utmost disorder, the people crying up and down the streets down with King George, King Wilkes for ever; that the Americans had refused to pay taxes of any kind, in consequence of which was a large force being sent there, both of sea and land forces; that the party of Polanders, who had been forced into the late election by the Russians interfering, had asked assistance of the Grand Seigneur, who had granted it, in consequence of which the Russians had sent 20 sail of the line and a large army by land to besiege Constantinople, etc., etc., etc. In relation to our present circumstances, they told us that our passage to Batavia was likely to be very tedious, as we should have a strong current constantly against us, and at this time of the year calms and light breezes were the only weather we had to expect. They said also that near where they lay was a Dutch packet boat, whose business was to go on board all ships coming through the Straits, to inquire of them their news, and carry or send with it letters, etc., to Batavia, with the utmost dispatch, which business they said her skipper was obliged to do, even for foreigners, if they required it. This skipper, he said, if we wanted refreshments, would furnish us with fowls, turtle, etc., at a very cheap rate. At 7, a light breeze springing up, we weighed and came to sail. At night some lightning was seen. 1770, October 3. Sailed all night. In the morn were past the Cape. At 8 it fell calm, and we were obliged to come to an anchor by reason of the strong current which ran to the westward. The Dutch packet, which we had been told of yesterday, and proved to be a sloop of no inconsiderable size, had been standing after us all morn, and still continued, gaining however but little, till a foul wind sprung up, on which she bore away. Our buffaloes had so entirely lost their stomachs by their long fast, that they eat scarce anything. However, lest they should take to eating again, a boat was sent ashore for grass, which returned with some, and a few plantains and unripe pawpaws, which when boiled eat nearly as well as turnips, only sweeter. At night, an Indian proa came on board, bringing the master of the sloop before mentioned. He brought with him 2 books, in one of which he desired that any of our officers would write down the name of the ship, commander's name, where we came from, and where bound, with any particulars we chose relating to ourselves, that might be for the information of any of our friends who might come after us, which we saw that some ships, especially Portuguese, had done. This book, he told us, was kept merely for the information of those who might come through these straits. In the other, which was a fair book, he entered the names of the ships and commanders, which only were returned to the governor and the Council of the Indies. On our writing down Europe as the place we had come from, he said very well, "Anything you please, but this is merely for the information of your friends." In the proa were some small turtle, many fowls and ducks, also parrots, parakeets, rice birds, and monkeys, some few of which we bought at the rate of $1 for a small turtle, the same at first for 10, afterwards for 15 large fowls, 2 monkeys, or a whole cage of paddy birds. 1770, October 4. Lightning in the night. In the morn, calms and light breezes not sufficient to stem the current, which was very strong. To make our situation as tantalizing as possible, innumerable proas were sailing about us in all directions. A boat was sent ashore for grass, and landed at an Indian town, where by hard bargaining some coconuts were bought at about 3 halfpence apiece, and rice in the straw at about 5 farthings a gallon. Neither here nor in any other place where we have had connections with them would they take any money but Spanish dollars. Large quantities of that floating substance, which I have often mentioned before under the name of sea sawdust, had been seen ever since we came into the straits, and more particularly today. Among it were many leaves, fruits, old stalks of plantain trees, plants of Pistia stratiotes, and such like trash, from whence we almost concluded that it came out of some river. At noon, by a good observation, we found Pulo Pasang, off which we lay at an anchor, to be laid down 5 miles too far to the northward, in La Neptune Orientale. In the evening, light breezes, so that we got a little ahead. 1770, October 5. Early in the morn, a proa came on board, bringing a Dutchman, who said that his post was much like that of him who was on board on the 3rd. He presented a printed paper of which he had copies in English, French, and Dutch, regularly signed in the name of the Governor and Council of the Indies by their secretary. These he desired we would give written answers, to which he told us would be sent express to Batavia, where they would arrive tomorrow at noon. He had in the boat turtle and eggs, of which latter he sold a few for somewhat less than a penny apiece, and then went away. The day was spent as usual in getting up and letting down the anchor. At night, however, we were very near Bantam Point. 1770, October 6. Sailed all night. In the morn, were almost up with an island called Pulo Babi, or Pulo Tounda, but were so far without it that it was thought best to go the outer passage. The land breeze, however, left us, as usual, about o'clock, and we came to an anchor, and spent the whole day without any sea breeze sufficient to stem the current, which was very strong, and ran constantly to the westward. We have observed it to be very various since we came into the straits, sometimes running with much greater violence than at others, but setting almost, if not continually, to the westward. Once only it was thought to have turned to the eastward for a few hours, but that was never made sufficiently clear. This violence would sometimes alter very considerably, several times in an hour. At night observed fire upon Pulo Tounda. 1770, October 7. Got the land breeze in the night as usual, and sailed with it till morn, when we were almost up with Wapping Isle, called by the Malays Pulo Tidong, where we anchored and lay still. The current was pretty strong, and brought with it plenty of sea sawdust, among which were even here some leaves and other productions of the land, also many cuttlefish bones, Portuguese men of war, and other recrements of the sea. In the afternoon we had a faint sea breeze, which ran us very near the length of the 3rd island, and then left us, so that the current took hold of the ship unawares, and had almost set her ashore on a small ledge of rocks, on which was not water enough for a small boat, which we sent to examine them. After we were at an anchor in the night, we observed lights upon some of the islands called Bedro or Les Mille Îles, some of which lay much nearer to Pulo Tudong than they are laid down in any of the draughts. 1770, October 8. Breezes were very uncertain all night, attended with thunder, lightning, and heavy rain, so that though we got out from our last night's disagreeable situation, and sailed all night, we were not in the morn at all ahead. So we anchored at 6. At 8, Dr. Solander and myself went ashore on a small islet belonging to the Mille-Îles, not laid down in the draft, laying from Pulo Bedro north by east 5 miles. The whole was not above 500 yards long and 100 broad, yet on it was a house and a small plantation, in which, however, at this time was no plant from whence any profit could be derived, except Ricinus palma Christi, of which the castor oil is made in the West Indies. Upon the shoal, about 1/4 of a mile from the island, were 2 people in a canoe, who seemed to hide themselves as if afraid of us. We supposed them to be the inhabitants of our island. We found very few species of plants, but shot a bat, whose wings measured 3 feet when stretched out, Vesp vampyrus, and 4 plovers exactly like our English golden plover, Charadrius pluvialis. With these and the few plants we returned, and very soon after a small Indian boat came alongside, having in her 3 turtle, some dried fish, and pumpkins. We bought his turtle, which weighed altogether 146 pound, for $1, with which bargain he seemed well pleased, but could scarcely be prevailed upon to take any other coin for his pumpkins, often desiring that we would cut $1 and give him part. At last, however, a Portuguese pataca, shining and well coined, tempted him to part with his stock, which consisted of 26. He told us that the island called in most drafts Pulo Babi was really called Po Toonda, and that called Pulo Bedro, Pulo Payon. At parting he made signs that we should not tell at Batavia that any boat had been on board with us. At 1 the sea breeze sprang up and carried us by 5 the length of all the islands called Pulo Pare. Off the east end of them, however, was a shoal, on which it broke a good deal, which we could not weather, so were obliged to anchor abreast a passage between it and the island, in which was 22 fathom water, not having daylight to carry us through. On all the islands of Pulo Pare were coconut trees, some houses, and vessels hauled up, and along the sides of the beach were neat fishing weirs. 1770, October 9. A fine land breeze, which held the greatest part of the night, ran us by Morn abreast of the island of Edam, so that we saw the vessels at anchor in Batavia Road and on Rust Island. At 10 it left us, and we anchored. By 11 it cleared up towards Batavia, so much that we saw distinctly the dome of the great church. At 1/2 after, sea breeze set in, and before 4 we were at anchor in Batavia Road. A boat came immediately on board us from a ship which had a broad pennant flying. The officer on board her inquired who we were, etc., and immediately returned. Both himself and his people were almost as spectres, no good omen of the healthiness of the country we were arrived at. Our people, however, who truly might be called rosy and plump, for we had not a sick man amongst us, jeered and flouted much at their brother seamen's white faces. By this time our boat was ready, which went ashore with the first lieutenant, who had orders to acquaint the commanding officer ashore of our arrival. At night he returned, having met with a very civil reception from the Shabandar, who, though no military officer, took cognizance of all these things. I forgot to mention before that we found here the Harcourt Indiaman, Captain Paul, and 2 English private traders from the coast of India. 1770, October 10 to 20. After breakfast this morning, we all went ashore in the pinnace, and immediately went to the house of Mr. Late, the only Englishman of any credit resident in Batavia. We found him a very young man, under 20, who had lately arrived here and succeeded his uncle, a Mr. Burnett, in his business, which was pretty considerable, more so, we were told, than our newcomer had either money or credit to manage. He soon gave us to understand that he could be of very little service to us, either in introductions, as the Dutch people, he said, were not fond of him, or in money matters, as he had began trade too lately to have any more than what was employed in getting more. He, however, after having kept us to dine with him, offered his assistance in showing us the method of living in Batavia, and assisting us in settling in such a manner as we should think fit. In order to this here were 2 alternatives, either to go to the hotel, a kind of inn kept by the order of government, where it seems all merchant strangers are obliged to reside, paying 1/2 P.C. for warehouse room for their goods, which the master of the house is obliged to find for them. We, however, having come in a king's ship, were free from that obligation, and might live wherever we pleased, after having asked leave of the council, which was never refused. We might therefore, if we chose it, take a house in any part of the town, and bringing our own servants ashore, keep it, which would be much cheaper than living at the hotel, provided we had anybody on whom we could depend to buy in our provisions. But this not being the case, as we had none with us who understood the Malay language, we concluded that the hotel would be the best for us, certainly the least troublesome, and maybe not vastly the most expensive. Accordingly, we went there, bespoke beds, and slept there at night. The next morning we agreed with the keeper of the house, whose name was Van Hayes, the rates we should pay for living, as follows: each person for lodging and eating 2 Rixdollars or 8s. per diem. For this he agreed, as we were 5 of us, who would probably have many visitants from the ship, to keep us at a separate table. For each stranger, we were to pay 1 Rixdollar 4s. for dinner, and another for supper and bed, if he stayed ashore. We were to have also for ourselves and friends tea, coffee, punch, and pipes, and tobacco, as much as we could destroy. In short, everything the house afforded, except beer and wine, which we were to pay for at the following rates: claret, 39 stivers, 3s. 3d. Hock, 1 Rix, 4s. Lisbon, 39, 3s. 3d. Sweet wine, 39, 3s. 3d. Madeira, 1 rupee, 4s. 6d. Beer, 1 rupee, 2s. 6d. Spa water, 1 Rix, 4s. Besides this, we were to pay for our servants, 1/2 a rupee, 1/3 a day each. For these rates, which we soon found to be more than double the common charges of boarding and lodging in the town, we were furnished with a table which, under the appearance of magnificence, was wretchedly covered. Indeed, our dinners and suppers consisted of 1 course each, the one of 15, the other of 13 dishes, of which, when you came to examine, seldom less than 9 or 10 were of bad poultry roasted, boiled, fried, stewed, etc., etc., and so little conscience had they in serving up dishes over and over again, that I have seen the same identical roasted duck appear upon table 3 times as a roasted duck before he found his way into the fricassee, from whence he was again to pass into forcemeat. This treatment, however, was not without remedy. We found that it was the constant custom of the house to supply strangers at their first arrival with every article as bad as possible, which if they, through good nature or indolence, put up with, it was so much the better for the house. If not, it was easy to amend their treatment by degrees till they were satisfied. On this discovery we made frequent remonstrances, and amended our fare considerably, so much that had we had any one among us who understood this kind of wrangling, I am convinced we might have lived as well as we could have desired. Being now a little settled, I hired a small house next door to the hotel, on the left, for which I paid 10 rixdi, £2 a month. Here our books, etc., were lodged, but here we were far from private. Every Dutchman almost that came by running in and asking what we had to sell, for it seems that hardly any individual had ever been at Batavia before who had not something or other to sell. I also hired 2 carriages, which were a kind of open chaises, made to hold 2 people, and drove by a man sitting on the coach box. For each of these I paid 2 Rex, 8s. a day by the month. And now being fairly settled, we sent for Tupaya ashore to us, who had till now remained on board, on account of his illness, which was of the bilious kind, and for which he had all along refused to take any medicines. On his arrival his spirits, which had been very low, were instantly raised by the sights which he saw, and his boy Tayeto, who had always been perfectly well, was almost ready to run mad. Houses, carriages, streets, in short everything, were to him sights which he had often heard described, but never well understood. So he looked upon them all with more than wonder, almost made with the numberless novelties, which diverted his attention from one to the other. He danced about the streets, examining everything to the best of his abilities. One of Tupaya's first observations was the various dresses which he saw worn by different people. On his being told that in this place every different nation wore their own country dress, he desired to have his, on which South Sea cloth was sent for on board, and he clothed himself according to his taste. We were now able to get food for him, similar to that of his own country, and he grew visibly better every day. so that I doubted not in the least of his perfect recovery, as our stay at this place was not likely to be very short. Ever since our arrival at this place, Dr. Solander and myself had applied to be introduced to the general or governor on one of his public or council days. We had been put off by various foolish excuses, and at last were plainly told that as we could have no business with him, we could have no reason to desire that favour. But as we had often pressed the thing, this, as an excuse, did not satisfy us, so I went myself to the Shabandar, who is also master of the ceremonies, in order to ask his reasons for refusing so trifling a request, but was surprised at being very politely received, and told that the very next morning he would attend us, which he did, and we 20 were introduced, and had the honour of conversing for a few minutes with his high mightiness, who, however, was very polite to us. Ever since our first arrival here, we had been universally told of the extreme unwholesomeness of the place, which we, they said, should severely feel on account of the freshness and healthiness of our countenances. This threat, however, we did not much regard, thinking ourselves too well seasoned to variety of climates to fear any, and trusting more than all to an invariable temperature in everything, which we had as yet unalterably kept during our whole residence in the warm latitudes, so had small reason to doubt our resolutions of keeping for the future. But before the end of this month, however, we were made sensible of our mistake. Poor Tupaya's broken constitution felt it first, and he grew worse and worse every day. Then Taieto, his boy, was attacked by a cold and inflammation on his lungs. Then my servants Peter and James, and myself, had intermitting fevers, and Dr. Solander a constant nervous one. In short, everyone on shore and many on board were ill, chiefly of intermittents, occasioned, no doubt, by the lowness of the country and the numberless dirty canals which intersect the town in all directions. Some days before this, as I was walking the streets with Tupaya, a man, totally unknown to me, ran out of his house, and eagerly accosting me asked if the Indian whom he saw with me had not been at Batavia before. On my declaring that he had not, and asking the reason of so odd a question, he told me that a year and a half before Mr. de Bougainville had been at Batavia with 2 French ships, and that with him was an Indian so like this that he had imagined it to be the identical same person, had I not informed him to the contrary. On this I inquired, and found that Mr. de Bougainville, who was sent out by the French to the Malouines or Falkland Islands, in order, as they said here, to sell them to the Spaniards, had gone from thence to the River Plate, and afterwards, having passed into the South Seas, maybe to other Spanish ports, where he and all his people had got an immense deal of money in new Spanish dollars, and afterwards came here across the South Seas, in which passage he discovered diverse lands unknown before, and from one of them brought the Indian in question. This at once cleared up the account given to us by the Indians of Tahiti of the 2 ships which had been here 10 months before us. Page 164 of this journal. These were undoubtedly the ships of Monsieur de Bougainville, and the Indian Otourul, the brother of Rete chief of Haidia. Even the story of the woman was known here. She, it seems, was a Frenchwoman who followed a young man sent out in the character of botanist in men's clothes. As for the article of the colours, the Indians might easily be mistaken, or Mr. de Bougainville, if he had traded in the South Sea under Spanish colours, might choose to go quite across with them. As for the iron which most misled us, that he undoubtedly bought in Spanish America. Besides the botanist mentioned above, these ships were furnished with 1 or more draftsmen, so that they probably have done some part of our work for us. 1770, October 21. After petitioning and repetitioning the Council of the Indies, our affairs were at last settled, and orders given to heave down the ship with all expedition. So she this day went down to Kuiper, called by the English Cooper's Island, where a warehouse was allotted for her to lay up stores, etc. We now began sensibly to feel the ill effects of the unwholesome climate we were in. Our appetites and spirits were gone, but none were yet really sick, except poor Tupaya and Taieto, both of which grew worse and worse daily, so that I began once more to despair of poor Tupaya's life. At last he desired to be removed to the ship, where he said he should breathe a freer air, clear of the numerous houses which he believed to be the cause of his disease, by stopping the free draught. 1770, October 28. Accordingly, on the 28th, I went down with him to Kuiper, and on his liking the shore, had a tent pitched for him, in a place he chose, where both sea breeze and land breeze blew right over him, a situation in which he expressed great satisfaction. The seamen now fell sick fast, so that the tents ashore were always full of sick. 1770, October 30. After a stay of 2 days, I left Upaya, well satisfied in mind, but not at all better in body, and returned to town, where I was immediately seized with a tertian, the fits of which were so violent as to deprive me entirely of my senses, and leave me so weak as scarcely to be able to crawl downstairs. End of section 50, October 1770.